Hey, everybody, welcome back to Pro AV today. As we innovate in technology, not only do we see innovations and capabilities and practical functions, but, we see things like the decreased form factor, and we see price accessibility become something that is incredibly important, so much so now really that we have supercomputers on our wrists and in our pockets. And as you look at those innovations, the technology is spilling into industries that it hasn't necessarily been in before, whether that's healthcare, hospitality, education, and, even industrial applications. And honestly, that's one of my favorite applications as somebody who's been kind of on the installation and industrial side of the business for quite some time. But, one guy that really is leading the charge on really wearables in that industrial space and AV kind of integration of technology in that industrial space is my next guest, Sean Petterson, CEO of a wearables company called StrongArm. Sean, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
Sean, for better or worse, right now, kind of the eyes of the world are on the B2B and industrial community because of supply chain challenges, distribution challenges, things like that. But this isn't a world that you've turned your eyes to for the first time. It's something that you've had really your pulse on for quite some time. And, let's talk about kind of StrongArm specifically. As you guys have built out this technology and really have driven advancements in the technology, what are some of the needs in the market really that you've seen pop up in the last 10 to 15 years that you guys are creating a solution for?
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question. I think it starts with what you said. I'm personally invested in it. My dad was an industrial athlete and he passed away on the job. So instead of running his, construction company, I went off to school to find ways to solve this problem, which are these injuries that happen at a clip of 38,000 an hour around the world, right? That's $3 trillion a year spent around the globe on stuff that I think is avoidable. So how do you avoid it? Because that's such a big problem. People ought to care, but how do you show them where to start? So when we actually started the business, it was exploratory in that nature, and I think part of that exploration was showing people that it's possible, because these are the oldest industries in the world. People have been moving boxes since they started trading, right? And the roles of environmental health and safety professionals have been to kind of carry through best practices decade after decade. But, a lot of that is process check. And, because industries are so old and have been around for so long, there's a momentum of kind of keeping up with that process check and those baselines. But technology hadn't really married the industries, and technology has just accelerated way greater than some of the underlying, metrics, KPIs that would have existed in these industries in the past. And for us, that was, somewhat frustrating, because I come from a personal background of experience needing to, wanting to have those in existence many years ago to avoid things that have happened. But a big part of it came down to first find the understanding, and then two, prove it, right? So when we started, we actually made exoskeletons, and the idea behind it was just to show people that there was a real opportunity to apply really rigorous human-centered design and engineering into the space. And we were really successful at that. And you could replicate all the things in the labs because the labs are at universities and the technology exists. But we wanted to prove those things at value in big organizations where safety can be a priority, but it's safety is a cost center. It's not a profit center. It doesn't necessarily get the same attention. So because of that, you run into the same challenges. How are you going to prove this at scale to a C-suite buyer who wants to equip 10, 20,000 people with this? And that's where we realized all that stuff we use in the lab needs to be brought into this space, and it needs to be democratized. And that means making it more accessible by cost. That means making it more accessible by implementation, ease of use, and translation of data. And all of those things had to be built in order for us to get to that baseline. So really long-winded answer to your question, but what people want and what people need and what the industry needs today is still an understanding. It's an understanding that there are different ways to look at the problem, and it's an understanding that there's a way to leverage things that have been thought of as a cost center and actually turn them into insights that can turn it into a profit center.
Well, Sean, I love that answer because it it spotlights really a couple different areas. And one thing that I'll stick on for a second, I think that a lot of people have misconceptions about, really, and I love that you call them this, the industrial athlete, right? When you think about the work that a lot of these industrial manufacturing plants and all these B2B companies and organizations are doing, it's very, very physical in nature, right? It is so much so that it is very high risk. And kind of putting the term athlete on there really opens up this idea of, you look at sports, and athletics has been a very heavily analytically tracked really opportunity for a while, right? When you think about analytics in sports, and you think about athlete tracking and miles per hour tracking, things like that. It's not a new technology from a sports perspective, but we're really bringing it now into the industrial side, into these industrial athletes, is something that's incredible. And, when we talk about kind of the intersection of really this digital analytical world and this physical world of industrial manufacturing, supply chain, things like that, we've seen that technology, even in a post-COVID world, has been a little bit more widely accepted, and people are frankly just a little bit more familiar with using technology like this. Talk about the worker experience, right? I mean, you guys at the end of the day are working to increase worker safety through monitoring, right? Talk about how that balance has to exist between the actual worker and the technology itself.
Yeah, it's kind of a similar vein in terms of the understanding, right? When you go and you deploy to a big client, you can, to the best of your abilities, be the first one in to speak to the values to the industrial athlete, right? And that's why we built the company. We built it to keep these industrial athletes power protected and productive. And that message can appear conflicting when one of our large clients now says, all right, everyone's going to utilize this, and we're going to make it available. So in that, there's always, I think, a balance in, what are they really using this data for? And it's our job to shepherd the best use of that data. For us, that means being fully transparent, and it means showing and building a platform that it's built for that proud, protected, and productive methodology. And then it's about showing everybody what's in it for them. And now that translates greatly across the map. But to kind of tackle those three subjects, first and foremost, with the transparency, is everyone has availability to the data. The industrial athletes can see their data. The managers can see their data, and they can see how that data is improving when they work together and communicate around safety proactively. From the point of how you build the hardware and what we're collecting, we just remove certain things that would make people uncomfortable. We pulled GPS out of the sensors because it made people uncomfortable knowing where they were in the warehouse. And we simply don't need to know exactly where you are at all times. We just need to know where you are in proximity to risk so that we can adjust the algorithms and send appropriate alerts. So we got around that with Bluetooth and with beaconing in ways that we can keep that anonymity and with that individual. So we can anonymize the data, and we can filter that data up into managers to truly be proactive around essentially how this data is showing us that safe behavior actually creates an ROI. And with that ROI, we can take cost savings and we can invest back in operations to make things smoother, less burdensome, and safer. And on the last bit of it, it's, again, showing what's in it for me. So for safety folks, it's pretty straightforward. We're making their jobs really easy. We're automating the most challenging part of their job. EHS people have to focus on not only injuries and prevention, but delivering compliance, both in terms of how are people going to come up with the best practices, and then how are we going to action them and measure them and put a cadence behind them. But also the rest of their day is spent dealing with injury reports for things that have happened, coming up with best practices, dealing with adjudicators, and then also looking at environmental compliance and regulatory needs and making sure that all the things in the organization are up to par with regulation. So their jobs are so busy. And musculoskeletal injuries are the hardest because they're not binary, they're accumulative, right? You may be sore on Monday, you may be in pain by Wednesday, but you may not get a back injury until Friday, right? And I think that accumulative nature, to be able to predict that way earlier, gives them more data to work from, to stay way ahead of the injuries and to find ways to now go and improve operations. So now we're going into operators who are now typically deploying this technology at scale, but aren't necessarily directly aligned with the need for EHS's goals, right? They have to enact it, but their KPIs aren't always safety. So now this seems like, okay, this is another thing I have to embed. What's in it for me? And for you, it's you have ways to show that you can make your operations more efficient because EHS has created a new piece out of what used to be a cost center. They have now found ways to actually invest in your operations. We can make that line not only more efficient, but we're making it safer. And by making it safer, you're going to reduce your injuries. By reducing your injuries, you're going to reduce your turnover. By reducing your turnover, you're going to increase your predictability. You're going to increase your reliability. You're going to reduce your downtime, rehiring and retraining, and all those things we have to spell out for folks. But when it really gets down to the person that matters most to us, the industrial athlete, how does this better their future? And now that comes into a play of understanding them, right? Understanding where they come from, what are their backgrounds, what are their motivations? And that varies. Some folks are really keen on the trends of wearables and their impacts, and they wear, Fitbits and Oura rings at home. And they love the idea that they have this data at work where they're working just as hard as an athlete on the field, but for 8 hours a day for, 20, 30, 40-year career, right? So some people are really early and eager adopters. Other folks are relatively selfless. And, this is tough work. So you're going to get tough people. And they think I can handle an injury. So for them, we need to make it clear about the long-term effects of some of these injuries, and maybe not relate them to pain because they're tough, but relate them to their inability to work, their inability to provide for their families, and really talk about how this information at the end of the day, of course, it helps you, but it really helps you provide for your families. It really helps you with stability. And maybe it's not just financially, but we hear so many stories where folks are not going home to play with their kids on a Friday night or a Sunday morning baseball game because they're icing their backs, right? And by implementing our data, our technology, and our services, we're hearing the other side of that coin where, I actually went to dinner with my wife at Friday night because I wasn't so tired after work. And it's that kind of way to present the information to get the early buy-in. And then to retain that buy-in, it's gamifying it, giving some ways to be incentivized and make the job, a little more personal, a little more interesting. And then once we're in there, finding ways to continually improve, understanding how that pain and that fatigue data is not just relevant for us to help you feel better at work, but also to help serve as an early indicator so that we can feed that information back to EHS, back to ops, to inherently come back in a loop that makes your job better.
Well, Sean, I want to focus just for a second on a little bit of that proactivity that you talked about, right? Yes, it's great to, obviously as an organization, you want to have the ROI, you want to have the impact, but really at the end of the day, as you mentioned, it's a worker play. It's an industrial athlete play, right? Where you are improving their quality of life by giving them access to these tools. And I think one of the things that stands out most is, specifically, we'll talk a little bit about some of the products that you guys have. You talk about that haptic feedback, and you're able to track kind of the torque algorithm and the tilt and really the bend of the knee and things like that. That's something that you think about maybe some of those grizzled veterans. The learning curve and the adaptability curve there is a little bit longer, but you talk about quality of life. This really is something where you are increasing not only productivity, ROI, but the literal quality of life of some of these employees. How do you make that jump?
So we have the benefit today of the proof, right? We've done this now on with 40 million hours of data across 40,000 industrial athletes across various jobs, various environments, and various corners and pockets of the world. So being able to point to real stories like the ones I shared with you earlier, and being able to make it quite clear to somebody, I think is how you get the initial bite in the investment. But how do you keep that going, right? Once the magic wears off, how do you really keep someone involved? It's about understanding how that person operates and what their values are. So what you're communicating can be a stream of continuous improvement, right? What we're talking about isn't a a massive change, right? But it is a behavior change, right? We are trying to figure out a way to tweak your behavior in a little bit more. To your point, some of the older veterans, right? A lot of times our biggest challenges are showing to them that even though your body has calloused itself and you're okay working in what we know is a very unsafe position, you may not feel that immediate pain because of those calluses, but let me show you what the real long-term effects are. And it's opening up the idea that you're at a super high risk of having to go to a surgery where you have to fuse your spine together, which means you're going to lose your mobility. You're going to have increased pain. You're going to have a great deal of challenges doing the things you love outside of work. So that's the informational buy-in, right? And then once you're on the system, it's a simple matter of tracking metrics and adapting the information based on that person's reaction. So what we have is dynamic haptic parameters. So that means on day one, we're going to focus on, we notice that you have high, sagittal velocity, right? So that means we're going to encourage you to start taking a pivot step. And at the end of that week, you may be nailing this motion. So next week, when you start on Monday, we're going to start promoting a different type of an alert. And we're going to promote different types of coaching materials for your manager to then come down and help you reinforce. And I think that message of the community is really important as well, because safety is complex, but safety is about people. And the challenge with the people part is that there's never been real data. So the only way you can be a coach in a warehouse where you're basically outnumbered 1 to 50 or 1 to 100 sometimes, you don't really have the opportunity to truly sit down and observe. So you're coming down from your ivory tower and you're telling people what to do. And you're doing it off of maybe a brief observation. Maybe someone is just really fatigued and they did something wrong in that exact moment you're walking by. But without that real-time data, it starts to become contentious because people feel like you're picking on them. And maybe your shift is just closest to the door. And maybe that's why, but still you feel picked on, right? Giving the data to both, with transparency, to both the industrial athlete and to the managers and to the safety people and to the ops people, make it pretty obvious, right? It's point blank. It says, and now it can be a conversation. We can say, hey, Luke, your safety score was a 70 on Monday, but then it dropped to a 60 on Tuesday, and it's been there ever since. What's happened? Was it the job? Was it the new role we put you on? Do you need some training to help you get up there? Or maybe there's a more personal conversation. Maybe he took on another job. Maybe he just had a kid. Maybe there's some things you can do managerially because you can both agree that a change needs to happen. And that change is best for the organization because we're giving you the data to have that. And now this is a confident and productive conversation versus someone coming down and calling you out. And I think that cultural aspect for us is actually the most impactful thing that we generate from the data over the haptic feedback and the other things that we deliver right out of the box.
Yeah, and I love that perspective too, right? It's so paramount in every industry really to focus on either the end user, the industrial athlete, really the person that it impacts most. And it's something really that I love the approach you guys are taking, just because it helps make the world go round, right? At the end of the day, people make the world go round. But jumping kind of a little bit more on really the organizational side, obviously, one of the big worries is compliance, whether it's OSHA compliance, whether it's union compliance, things like that. And really some of those things are almost kind of paramount on the job, but really so is privacy, right? That's one of the conversations that, we have cross industry when technology is involved is, okay, is this tracking what I'm eating for lunch every day? Am I volunteering this information? But the reality is that, honest to God, Sean, nobody really wants to give a straight answer in most industries, but I feel like you have really a great answer to this. And let's talk about kind of some of that privacy versus maybe some of that compliance data, especially with the unions involved. Talk to me about really how you guys are working with the industrial athletes themselves, the unions and the organizations, to make sure really they're getting the data that they need and not a whole lot else.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an interesting dynamic because you're seeing things like the Warehouse Worker Protection Act come up, and you're seeing increased, budgets to regulatory environments, and you're seeing increased press around requirements from OSHA and et cetera. And, you know, you'd hope that all that stuff is going in the right direction. But the truth is, when you're just forcing it from a corporate level, now you're impacting the pockets. And when you're impacting the pockets, that is going to go down to the people that are in the line items for those costs, which doesn't necessarily include safety in that conversation. It actually just increases the stress level on safety. And when it comes down to, at the end of the day, human behavior, and that trickles down through an organizational effect, what we're finding is that in some environments, people are actually reporting less. And you see that at big companies where they're misincentivizing, well, they're incentivizing the wrong thing, right? They're incentivizing in some cases, and this is where OSHA's had to step in and kind of hedge some of these regulations. You don't want people to have KPIs around injury reporting and safety metrics, right? Because they're going to brush things under the table. And now you're seeing this where it comes back to bite companies in the butt. So now looking at it from the union perspective as well, for us, that's another fine balance, because that organization, if we come in from the corporate side, the corporate thinks that, the company, the union thinks that the corporate is forcing them in to go after some big brother information. But if we go on the union side, now the corporate sometimes thinks that we're trying to partner with the unions to call them out on things and get them in trouble and cause revolt, right? And at the end of the day, data doesn't lie. Let's just use it.
Right.
And I think we have grown through all these varying, hot topic debates over the last 10 years by, being Switzerland, by being the person in the middle that can say, we're all trying to do the right thing. Let's just focus on the right outputs and let's use the momentum. And I think the key unlock for us to be in that position has been to continue to take that narrative that safety isn't everyone's priority, right? It really, at the end of the day, it isn't. But in the long run, it's directly aligned with everyone's priorities and goals. It's just a matter of us painting the picture as to how that matters, which means for operators, we focus on their ROI. For HR, we focus on their turnover. For EHS, they already are bought in. Let's just focus on making it easy for them to deploy. For the C-suites, it's all of the things that are highly relevant. And I think today, as you've mentioned, there's, our industries are in the spotlight. Part of that is because of the hiring crisis. Part of that is because of, the objective challenges at Amazon and what's happening in that neck of the woods. Part of it is the general challenges with supply chain. And at the end of the day, if you really boil it down to all of these things, when you're making products and you're shipping products, people are the answer. They are there. And if we want to understand how to solve those problems, you need to have the tools to understand it in a great breath that interconnects all the things, because they're all related. So where we are and where we sit is, let's be transparent. Let's be open. Let's use the data, and let's involve as many constituents in the decision-making that happens around that data so that we can come up with a progressive change. And at the end of the day, our sole goal is to put the industrial athlete at the heart of those conversations. So we could tell everyone from the C-suite all the way down to the floor why that narrative matters and why the industrial athlete's health benefit and quite frankly, narrative around their complexities of data matter to an organization and how they make decisions.
And I love really the way that you phrase that too, right? Making sure that you're working with people on a Switzerland type level, right? Because data doesn't lie, right? Data is data, and you can make whatever decisions you want from it. And that's true not only on the industrial side, but also in other industries, right? Who may not have quite the exact same chain of command from leadership, union to employee or athlete. Talk to me a little bit about maybe some of the places that this tech can scale into. One jumps out to me specifically is, the local production crews and roadie crews and things like that are complying every single day with OSHA requirements, but are doing things like rigging and doing things like lifting and rolling some of the biggest stuff in the world. And it feels like that market is a little bit underserved when it comes to stuff like this.
Yeah. It's an interesting one, right? So for us, where we started was in, like I told you, the prove it phase, right? And in that prove it phase, you need to have statistical significance, which means you need to have a whole lot of data. And the best way to get a whole lot of data with accuracy and statistical significance is to come up with environments that this can thrive, which are highly repetitive, right? So we started out in manual materials handling, which means we were on the bodies of individuals that were loading pallets and stacking shelves. And then we got smart about that data. We came up with baselines, we came up with correlations, and then we're able to train algorithms for people driving fork trucks. And then from there, we got smarter and used the database and correlated, came with a baseline, and then developed a new algorithm to help support people in manufacturing. And as we get smarter and smarter, the data starts to snowball and it becomes relevant. And at the end of the day, what you need to do is just relate what you're doing to a large and significant baseline. And it's in the deviations that you're performing, either up or down from that baseline, that give us the insights. So as we're growing, we're learning all the new ways that we can find essentially a big pool to start from and then develop the algorithm for that individual. So where that is, relevant today is in long distance truck driving. So our ability to get on individuals who are primarily in the truck for several hours at a time, but all the 80 to 90% of the injuries happen as soon as they get out of a long drive, jump out of the truck, late for what they have to do, and rush to get something completed on time. Their bodies are cold, they're cramped up, they've been sitting hunched over behind the steering wheel for the whole time, and they're just not prepped. Our ability to step in, intervene, and alert to say, hey, just take a break to stretch real quick, it'll be worth it, is kind of the example of how we evolve and are getting out of the warehouse. So now as we look at all the others we're exploring, like you mentioned, event setup, AV setup, folks doing stuff on movie sets, etc., all these different dynamic type activities. It's how do we find the nuances in those activities? And then how do we correlate to a greater baseline? And then how do we get very specific on what to alert? Because you're working hard, you're working fast, you're working in the dark, it's sweaty, there's people everywhere. How do you actually focus on yourself in the moment? And it's us to say, our value is just to kind of give you a tap on the shoulder to say, hey, watch out, you're about to do something risky. And as we learn about that, it comes down to being able to train, using ML at edge, being able to train and understand how the dynamics of that data change throughout your environment. And we learn about you. So we have data engineers that do engineering studies, and we timestamp movements. And the punchline basically is back to what I said earlier when it comes to the ergonomic functions. They're accumulative. So the way that we look at the things that we alert is essentially all about exposure, right? It's easy to understand that our temperature sensor can give you readings around heat exposure, and our air quality sensor can give you understandings about exposure to, particulate matter. But when it comes to ergonomics, it's usually not as binary for folks to kind of wrap their head around. But we look at your risky posture as exposure. So the more time you spend over in forward flexion, you're compressing and adding a great deal of force that's degradative. So degradative force being applied to the lumbar and the erector spinae, muscles in your spine and the bones in your spine that are truly becoming fatigued, being blocked off from oxygen and starting to degrade, right? So there's a complex science into the way that you can look at that. And we just treat it as, here's a baseline metric for how much risk you put yourself on. And that's like the deep science that we take to learn to be more dynamic to address it. But the simple way to think about it is like a tachometer in your car, right? You're going to go as close as you can to that red line because you're getting your job done and you're working hard. And we just want to be the little light that says you have to shift, right? And I think that's how we see our sensors, is that they're like tachometers in a car that help you perform at your best without going over the limit.
Spoken like a true data guy. Baselines and deviations from the norm. I love to hear it. We could talk about this all day, Sean, but hey, we'll find a way to get you back on the show, I'm sure. Really, this is this is applicable not only really to the industrial side and the warehouse and the manufacturing side, but you mentioned really some of these emerging markets for you guys as well. Would love to have an extended conversation one of these days, have you back on the show. But Sean Petterson, CEO, StrongArm, thanks so much for hopping on the show today.
Thank you too. It's great to meet you. Have a good one.
And thank you guys for tuning in. Be sure to tune in next time.